Hi, everybody. I think we'll just wait a couple moments here as people file in, as it is right on the dot 1 o'clock. So I'll just keep you warm while we wait to make sure that everybody can join before we dive in. But thank you if you're one of the early birds who've already joined. Appreciate it. We should get going in about 30 seconds to a minute. Just watch people file in and then we'll get going.
Perfect.
Just for those who are still joining, we're just going to give it a minute here as people file in, and then I will kick off in earnest. Thank you for joining and coming on time. I think we're at 1:01 or so, so I'm going to get a slow roll started. I know people probably jumped in from other meetings, but just to start, you can see two faces on the screen and then two live faces on the screen. I'm Adam Garreau. I lead strategic solutions here at Sponsor Pulse, and I'm really pumped to not be doing this completely by myself and just having me blah 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 all over it, because I got somebody really awesome to join me and who has a ton of insight and connection to programs like FIFA and things that go on in the sponsorship and sports and entertainment space. So Dr. Cheri Bradish, director of the Future of Sport Lab, who partnered with us on this research piece, and you'll hear a bit from both of us, but I'll just quickly let you say hello. You're coming to us from the United Kingdom right now, yeah?
I am. I've been at a series of meetings in London, so just north of the city now.
Got it.
West, so thank you for all your good work on this.
Thank you for the inspiration to really dive into this in I'd say somewhat of a different way than sometimes Sponsor Pulse dives in. Sometimes, and we will be post event, very focused on sponsor outcomes for brands that activate around the event. And sometimes we will sprinkle in some consumer and fan sentiment there as well. But really, that's about half of the story here, if not more, is really how Canadians are feeling about their hosting duties, so to speak. So we've got me in Toronto. You're in England. They're very appropriate for the World Cup webinar, if you'll allow me. And we will get going. Apparently, my PowerPoint is just connecting. So sorry.
That's okay.
I don't know what we're connecting to, but there we go. We're connected. Just some housekeeping off the top as we get in. Everyone will get a recording. So if you have to run, you wanted to share it with a colleague, you'll get a link to a recording, so you'll be no worries. Please ask questions. Let us know where you're coming from as well. There's a lot of kind of international content in the deck. It is focused on Canada, but there's obviously lots of nations competing. So we'd love to hear where you're coming from, even if you're within Canada, where specifically you're coming from. Two host cities, Toronto, Vancouver, but there's plenty of awesome communities in between. Comments encouraged. We want your questions. We'll try to get to all of them. Thank you to those who submitted in advance. It means we had a little time to prepare some answers, and we'll do our best with any other questions that come through. And of course, sponsorpulse.com. Check it out. There's lots of insights, blogs, etc. Things on FIFA, but also the Olympics or any other topic you might imagine in the space. What are we doing? Why are we talking today? If you were to kind of live in your algorithm as a sponsorship or a sports and entertainment professional, this is probably what you open your phone and see on a daily basis. Monumental betrayal of over ticket prices. Worst deal I've ever seen. Transit won't be ready. There's a free fan fest. No, it might be ticketed, and now it will be mostly free. Hotel room costs. Doctors are worried about ER capacity. There might be a strike of electrical workers. This is, I think, what many of us are consuming as people who work in the industry, and trying to wade through this and understand how do Canadians actually feel about this event is not an easy task, right? And not to mention these, which are the seats that go somewhat viral. And all I'll say about that is empty seats never look good, no matter how sturdily constructed or how comfortable. Empty seats don't look great, but when these seats are potentially filled with cheering fans, I think you'll have a different opinion about them. But let's leave it out of necessarily our take on this and instead focus on what Canadians are telling us in research. I did want to also contrast those headlines with a reality, which is the same day many of those headlines were flying around. A friend reached out to me in Victoria, BC to say, oh, there's a trial event happening for a watch party for the friendly. And, for these people it was a pretty cold day, about 9 degrees. You had hundreds of people packed in to watch a friendly. You had sponsors activating with a big line, ready to kick a ball in a Coca-Cola challenge. And you had people leaping out of their seats or their camping chairs every time something exciting happened for Team Canada. It's important for us to try to balance both sides of these coins, that yes, the media does love talking about events as they lead in about how big of a potential challenge they'll be. If we even look back at Milano Cortina, we weren't going to have hockey, right? The rink wasn't ready. And unfortunately for Canadians, maybe we wish that rink maybe never got finished because of the way things ended. But I joke, but point is, there is a cottage industry of kind of flooding the market with a lot of concerns ahead of an event. That doesn't mean that it won't be true after the event. We'll have to see how things go. But we do need to have a healthy conversation both about how Canadians actually feel and the fact that in a test event on March 31st, we had lots of happy fans, enjoying activation in Victoria, just for example. Okay, so how will we try to cut through all this and come to some kind of insight about, where Canadian sentiment's sitting, now that we're about, call it a month and a bit before kickoff? We surveyed 1,500 Canadians multiple times, age 13 to 64. So it, generally speaking, does speak to what Canadians are talking about. That's a representative sample across the country. Age, gender, income, all those factors have been weighted so that when we say 32%, as near as possible, we're talking about something that may not be scientifically to the very percentage point of what Canadians are thinking, but it's a very, very good indicator. We'll be talking about multiple waves of the research that we've done with Cheri. One was, call it a baseline. Obviously, in September of 2025, we knew the event was coming. But before most announcements, this initial wave of how Canadians were feeling happened before we found out matches and ticket prices and the seats went up. Then we get to February, just a couple months ago, and now ticket prices have launched. We know what matches are in play. Some of the conversation has shifted. Excitingly, if you've signed up for this webinar or if you enter your information to download the report, we'll also be pulsing you with another hit of, call it right now. We're surveying people right now to see how this has shifted. And then as much as we all want information before something happens, most importantly, especially as we talk about legacy and sentiment, is going to be after the event. How did their feelings leading in change, up, down, sideways, once the event actually happens and we see, how the things on the pitch and off the pitch play out. One thing I want to call out is this is very kind of fan look ahead focused. We will be separately looking at both kind of that sentiment piece post event, but also then sponsor impact, what brands kind of broke through and won. And it's, there's already a comment in the chat, a very complex sponsorship landscape where we've got local city partners. You've got people maybe activating with Canada Soccer or with individual players in that portfolio. Then you've got global FIFA partners. It's a big spider web of potential involvements, and it'll be interesting to unpack how Canadians teased all that apart. So let's just take a moment before we talk about kickoff. Where is the sport of soccer at in Canada? Where does FIFA sit? And obviously, we do expect massive attention as hosting. Long-term trend here, kind of pulsing our data every 6 months, is that FIFA, the Men's World Cup in particular, is now reaching about half of the Canadian population. And we're talking about events that are happening outside the country when they're just largely consumed via media. We'll continue to track this through the event itself, but it is already in a very, call it crowded or fragmented or lots of opportunity, a landscape in which Canadians have more soccer that they can consume than ever before. FIFA's up there in terms of engagement. Obviously, it only happens every 4 years. Then you get MLS, some international competitions like English Premier League, and then if we kept going, Bundesliga, La Liga, League One, on and on and on. And you can see the roster fills out with everything from CPL to NWSL to NSL. So there's more soccer than ever before. That for these properties is a good thing, and also a double-edged sword in the sense that there's a lot of fragmentation. But FIFA currently, as we've said, generally reaches about 42% of the Canadian population. So if that's kind of where we're starting, coming off the backs of the last World Cup, one of the first questions we've got to ask, and obviously for everybody on this call, you're very aware that FIFA's coming. You could probably mention the date, the number of matches, which matches are where, because we work in the industry. And sometimes we can be surprised to find out that Canadians might not be as aware of something as we are, because we live and breathe it. So first we'll just start with, are you aware that we're hosting the World Cup? We've asked this in a variety of ways. Are you aware that North America's hosting? Are you aware that Canada's hosting? And are you aware that Toronto and Vancouver specifically are hosting? First finding here is just to say awareness is high. I'll be honest, doing this kind of work on major events, the reality is there's always going to be 10 or 20% of the population that, unless you're in their backyard, aren't paying attention to sport or live events. It's just life. So getting 70% plus of the Canadian population aware that this is coming. And importantly, in the two host markets, it's nearing 90%. So yes, Canadians know this event is coming. And you can see in these results, while it ticked up slightly between September and February, a lot of that awareness had been built already in the fall of 2025. If we ask now just a couple other waves of data, interest and excitement, depending, which adjective you want to use, you see something similar to kind of that level of engagement with FIFA as it is right now. So interest is around 60% of Canadians. It's much higher in the host markets. There's some who are saying, I'm not at all interested. That's a reality. When you go to excitement, which is a little more, emotional connection, you start to see that 42% number come back. And so right now, the percent of Canadians who typically watch FIFA is around the percent who say they're committed, they're excited to see what happens. It's not to say that additional promotional events, and keep in mind, this is from February, there may be more surging happening right now. We'll be releasing those other waves of research. But again, we continue to grapple with this kind of half the population number for just how big this event's going to be. If we go, okay, most Canadians know it's coming. About half, engage with the property in some way in other years, and that kind of matches the excitement levels. Let's really dive into how they're planning to engage with the property. In terms of, how you can engage with the upcoming World Cup, obviously it being hosted in Canada is going to open doors that haven't existed for past World Cups. So first, we're going to group together watching and attending. So, at the time here, some people may have tickets in their pocket. Some still may be planning to hopefully get tickets in their pocket. This stayed largely stable. You can see we have about, 2/3 of the population who are saying, somehow, some way, I'm going to consume this event. And, what I'll call out immediately is that's a lot bigger than the 40-50% we've seen for past World Cups. And one of the big questions marketers have posed to us, and also others, is this event going to help grow the game of soccer, or at least grow interest in the FIFA World Cup? Or is it just going to be the same group of people who always watch, now having the opportunity to watch it happening in their time zone, in their city, etc.? So we broke this down, and what you can see on the left-hand side here is, what I'll get to, it most importantly, is that of that group who's saying, I'm going to watch or attend some way, somehow, the upcoming FIFA event, a pretty large portion, about 20%, say, I really don't watch the World Cup typically. And so, there is evidence, at least in intention, that there will be an audience of people who are not FIFA international soccer diehards, who are, somewhat committed to consuming the event. It's actually gone up significantly in the GTA since we first started pulsing. Obviously, there's more existing soccer fandom in the GTA as a very multicultural and host city for an MLS franchise. And it's cool to ask, okay, so you're kind of a new recruit. What's driving you to just kind of raise your hand to say you're in this time? And it's really interesting, as much as the men's national team having greater performance is part of it, as much it's just literally kind of the interest in watching us on the world stage be a host country for this big event. That is the number one reason these casual fans are kind of ready to go tune in. Yes, it's partially to cheer for Team Canada, but you can see more and more they're just curious to watch the show and to see us represented globally. So there is evidence that there will be some kind of new recruits. In terms of how they plan to watch, we've seen stability there. One of the questions that came through before the event was kind of, how do people plan to engage? And obviously, as much as ticket prices are the main focus, we have to keep in mind, here in Toronto, millions of people aren't going to attend a single match. There's a certain number who can, and the rest are going to be potentially watching at viewing parties or at home. And so you can see that tentatively, the intention in the third bucket here is about a third of those who plan to engage with the event are saying, yes, I will watch in some kind of event. Now, as of February, that's largely at what you would call unofficial gatherings, bars and restaurants, right? And then like at the stadium, public watch parties. Now, I'll be honest, we're 6 weeks or 5 or 6 weeks out, and the details are just starting to come out that might get people more committed to watching in official events. But you can see, at least as of February, that was kind of the last of the in-person events that people had talked about. But again, those plans have come into focus. Obviously, watching live, following on digital and social is going to take a big piece of this. But we're kind of waiting still to see the promotion. And now we kind of have ticketing information or price, whether it's free or not. We have artists being announced who are going to be performing. I think it's more reasonable to expect in the wave we're doing right now that we'll start to see pickup there. But as of right now, modest compared to kind of the more casual way that people are looking to engage. A lot of talk about the tourist dollars and the travel requirements and the hotel prices. We did see, kind of as news unfolded from September to February, some softening in the percent of Canadians who are like, I'm going to go to Toronto or Vancouver if I don't already live there to check this out. That decline was driven by older Canadians, 45 plus. I think as ticket prices became available, matches came out, it was inevitable that maybe some of the Canadians who had thought, yeah, maybe I will, kind of pulled back on that. That's not to talk about the international audience that'll be flooding Toronto and Vancouver to cheer for their teams, but this is the domestic travel audience. We've also seen, naturally those who live in Western Canada are identifying Vancouver as kind of their target location, and vice versa, those who live in Ontario are targeting Ontario. And a few lucky souls are kind of planning to go to both, who have both the funds and the access to potentially see maybe Team Canada in both locations. We'll continue to monitor this. And again, see how these people and this impact happen, once the event wraps. When we ask people kind of why would you visit, we saw, over time, Canadians have continued to say, like, I would be visiting to attend both live and also just to be part of the atmosphere. You can see some softening in kind of other softer tertiary reasons. So really it is the people who are remaining, who are planning to travel, are going to be very focused on the live experience, either the atmosphere at official events or the live matches themselves. The kind of, make a trip of it is softening as people start to firm up their plans. And then appropriate, as we've got both of our hosts in different countries. I'm in Canada and Cheri's in England right now, which we saw a little trend down. We won't make too big a deal of it, but this is asking Canadians who they're going to cheer for. Canada is a very multicultural country. The World Cup got massive engagement even before Canada's men's team was playing in it. I think everybody in Canada knows somebody who cheers for one of the teams on this board. Most Canadians are telling us, I will be cheering for Canada, but there is a lot of support for other countries, from Brazil to Argentina to England and on and on. And so, for marketers and those looking to lean into storytelling during this period, one of the big things that we will talk about as we get further in the deck is Team Canada's performance will play a large role in how Canadians feel about hosting this event. That's almost guaranteed in the research that we can see. And now, obviously, as a fan, we're all hoping that is a positive story. But for these casual fans, yes, it is interesting to kind of see the atmosphere, see us on the world stage. But there isn't necessarily the same thing if Canada, unfortunately, doesn't perform as well as many of us are hoping. So I'm going to pause there. If that's kind of just, a very detailed look at Canadians' awareness, anticipation, how big we think it can be, or hopes to be. And right now, the marketing data that we've got is telling us that they're largely going to engage through viewership and maybe casual gatherings, with potential update from us saying, with more announcements coming, we're starting to see more momentum for those official parties and things like that. I'll move into a part that I think is closer to closer to Cheri's heart, and the purpose of this project is equal parts kind of tracking interest as a live sporting event, but also really understanding how Canadians feel about it. It's not usual. It's never happened before that we're hosting some of the World Cup matches. It's expensive. It requires government investment. It requires lots of things. And, there's always that discussion of, are we getting enough return? Are Canadians going to be satisfied with what is left behind? So we'll start, and Cheri, I don't know if when you first saw these numbers, when we asked Canadians, on the right-hand side here, how likely do you think it will be that FIFA 2026 leaves a positive legacy in Canada? I'm curious what you may have thought if you had to bet, not that we'd be betting on it. Would you have expected kind of, largely positive, yes, but maybe softening a bit as we got closer to the event? I'm just curious, like if we had placed a friendly bet on it.
Yeah, I mean, I think it'll be interesting when we hear comments perhaps later, but my sentiment is, and this is a bit grounded in research, but a bit, my personal opinion, the numbers that you presented are really easy to understand, the science of those numbers. I think legacy is a bit of an art and a science. And so that's why I think when we see these things measured before, and I don't really remember what the legacy sentiment was, let's say around the 2010 Olympics. So I think it's about the storytelling and the narrative after that helps reinforce the legacy. So I don't know that I was particularly surprised, because I don't really think, in particular, I would say nationally, we really have known for a long time what the legacy is, right? Even when you were collecting this wave, I don't even think the fan festival details. I mean,
Exactly.
we know there was the debate whether it was free or not. So, and that's now been sorted, but a real understanding of legacy isn't something I don't think has necessarily been really well massaged. And so from a consumer sentiment, I'm not surprised really with the numbers.
I'd agree. I think, generally the thing that I've typically learned over my career is that when you feel like there could be some negativity surrounding something, often Canadians aren't as aware of the potential controversies like I threw up earlier. It's not to say those things don't matter and need to be addressed and taken seriously, but when you work in the industry itself, the analogy we often use is if you work in a certain food industry and there's maybe a recall or something like that, it feels like it's the biggest news and everybody must have heard that these cans of soup were recalled or whatever that is.
Yeah.
It's the talk of the office. And then you kind of step into the general population and they go, oh, I love that soup. We have to remember that, for many Canadians who just love sport and want to cheer for their country, that these discussions can be, and it's just being transparent, can be shaped by the stories that are told coming out of the games.
Right. And I mean, even the announcement today, am I right?
Yes.
Canada Soccer received additional funding from the federal government for a training facility. That, there's so many things that are happening in real time, but that I think will be really interesting, because you look at how the last World Cup really helped women's sport grow, but it's something that we have to see in the marketplace, right?
Totally agreed. I think the one thing we know for sure heading in is that, we'll call it what it is, more Canadians are betting on a positive legacy than are betting on a unlikely legacy. And I think that's something to take to heart for us to say, at least there's the opportunity for it to be a good story. And it'll all be about exactly like you talked about, when the dust settles, trying to as much separate on-pitch performance, and hopefully Canada goes on to win the whole thing, whatever. But separating that to talk about what lasting legacy there was. It may not be a building that they can point at every time. And you just mentioned an institute that was announced, funding for was announced today. So there may actually be some infrastructure discussions, but sometimes it has to be about, the success in the youth game or tourism activity or Canada on a global stage. And, making sure those stories are told in the balance that Canadians can understand. So that's where we're at. With all the hubbub that happened between September and February, to have a relatively small drop in commitment to thinking that there'll be a positive story at the end of it was probably still pretty resilient. And we'll continue to pulse this one more time pre and then again post to see now that it's all said and done. We asked Canadians just kind of some attitudes. I feel proud that Canada's hosting is still at 2/3. If somebody didn't agree here, I want to be clear, you can be neutral. It doesn't mean 30% are unproud or not proud. I don't think that's a word, but there you go. You get what I'm saying. There's a lot of talk in this research that comes through about just kind of, we've seen in our non-sponsorship research just how important Canadian pride is and Canada on the world stage and all these kinds of topics that have come about through some of the political environment. And you can see people kind of playing out here that, this is a moment for us to host the World Cup, and that is very meaningful. You can see there is some concerns, and we will get into those, particularly amongst residents of the host cities, but they're not outweighed, or they don't outweigh some, potential positivity. And I'll be candid, if you ask us what percent of Canadians said that the public funds used for this event could be better used elsewhere, the percent of those who agreed with that statement actually softly declined. And, you get not necessarily excitement about public funds being spent, but there was no uptick in our research of Canadians saying, whoa, what a minute, the cost is too high. And, Cheri, I think that may be part of what you're discussing, which is the story about how these funds ultimately end up getting used is still being written, even as of this morning, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
When we ask Canadians where they would like to see that spending, that may be, a place that is potentially at odds with how things may end up. And again, we'll see. We've asked Canadians, like, do you support government investments in the following? And you can see, if you were to kind of be on a sliding scale, if you leave us behind transit and infrastructure improvements, which many, large events typically have a history of leaving behind, either a rail line or a highway that got widened or a new subway line or things like that. Arguably some of, depending how it's positioned, I don't know, Cheri, if you agree, some of the work that has happened in Toronto, at least, at times has been discussed as kind of getting ready for FIFA, even if it wasn't explicitly a FIFA subway line or a LRT for the FIFA. There was a little bit of positioning to be like, this city, if it wants to host things like the World Cup, is going to need more transit. And we have seen more transit, coming in Toronto in the last year. So you can see, when we get down to just FIFA itself and, funding like the FIFA activities of hosting this, the permission to spend gets a little lower, but it's largely positive again. And we'll continue to track this and see how it feels afterwards. I was going to ask you, Cheri, if you think about kind of where people are probably most concerned in Toronto and Vancouver, it can be tough. Are you surprised at all to see like traffic and congestion, number one, over some of the other things? It seems maybe like kind of a daily life.
Well, I wondered if there's a halo effect of, in general, consternation with Toronto traffic, being a commuter myself. And so I wondered if that was part of it. And I think on your previous slide, the concerns around infrastructure, I mean, we're at a time when the GTA in particular, for those from afar in Toronto, has been going through a lot of calls for new infrastructure, some not related to the city, some is more provincial, but I think in a consumer's mindset, perhaps that may be part of it. And so I wondered if that's where perhaps some of that thinking might be from.
I think you're right. I think both of these cities, like any major city probably in the world, is like the daily struggle of congestion and traffic and transit is top of mind. I think it's telling that it's kind of number one, however, that it would also argue that some of these things that have flashed across our screens, like, oh, the healthcare system isn't ready. Sure, Canadians want a stronger healthcare system, and you could, get them to understand that maybe the increased tourism and things like that will create a crunch on the healthcare system, but it's not nearly up there with some kind of just more tangible things that they're almost guaranteed to. Is my commute going to get longer because we're hosting? Is kind of the question. You can see many say none of the above, that they don't have any concerns. If we flip the coin and say, what are some of the benefits? You can see even trending up as recent as February was like, I'm excited about the benefit of increased visibility for Canada. And I think you, Cheri, probably would agree. We've seen through the Olympic, excitement of cheering for Team Canada, four nations. Right now, Canadians are really more than ever looking for reasons to be proud and to be on the world stage. In terms of tourism impact, they do understand the financials there. And then you can see some of the things that Cheri referenced would be kind of potential benefits long-term, like increased participation in the sport among youth. And then, that's even ahead of infrastructure. Cheri, do you want to, maybe we could linger a bit just on like how these events can impact youth sports? I thought would be maybe helpful. One thing I'll just tee you up with is we did a bit of research earlier this year, and it showed, when we asked parents of kids who are in sport why they chose the sport they chose, there's lots of things you'd understand, like, hey, we put them in it. It's my favorite sport, whatever, the usual stuff. But one of the biggest drivers was that they fell in love with it through major events. They saw it during the Olympics. They saw that it's their favorite sport to watch. And then they said, I want to do that. Have you seen that on the ground as somebody who, I kind of sit in marketing land? You're involved with that too, but you're often a little closer to programs that are, impacting youth and getting communities moving and things like that.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're going to see legacy projects. It's been talked about in some of the narrative launched in the next month, in 2 or 3 different references when we talk about legacy. And I really can speak more, not just to the GTA, I suppose, and I'll talk about in a moment how I have a partnership with the city, but I think we've heard in 2 or 3 different narratives how there'll be a lean in towards more soccer pitches created in the 2 urban hosting areas in particular, and also coast to coast. And I think a couple of the partners are also, I know Coke is doing the cross country tour, but I do think a couple of the partners are, we may see them leaning into talking about grassroots initiatives as well. And then, there's that measurement that I'm sure Canada Soccer is doing, that if you see it, you want to be it. And so it's even just creating opportunities. And I don't know if the Fan Fest is directly it, but other opportunities to really get close to the people of the World Cup.
I totally agree. I think many, you see in the storytelling of elite athletes, there's often that question of like, how did you decide to become, a soccer player? How did you decide to become a swimmer? And there's usually a moment that often does point at, not necessarily an older brother or sister or cousin, but points at somebody in who was on the screen, who was a moment that we were all cheering for, a Canadian athlete or a pro athlete in your hometown. And these moments do have a generational lasting impact. Sometimes it's difficult to measure, but, stepping outside soccer and even the Olympic discussion, with the Jays playoff run, I can sort of see in my own community here that there's, I know it's anecdotal, but there's way more kids in that like golden age of like 8 to 14 years out there with baseball gloves this spring than there was last spring, because they just fell in love with the sport and said, I want to do that too. And, there's a big opportunity here for that for soccer, which we know is already a massive, probably the most participated sport in Canada, and one we're increasingly competing in.
Yeah, I think it speaks to, it's just very democratic sport in the sense that it's much more accessible. So I think that's it's a really good thing that we're aware of that too.
Exactly. And, so I think one of the things we're talking about as we talk about legacy is, maybe 20 years ago, and you can, Cheri, agree or disagree, if somebody said, what was the legacy of hosting that major sporting event? The mind typically would go to kind of economic impact of tourism and facilities built, some stadium to point at and say, well, that wasn't here before and it's here now. And it's not to say that other things weren't discussed, but I think the discussion potentially about the legacy of FIFA 2026 will be more nuanced, to talk about, seeds that got planted that may not return benefits for 20 years in youth or in different communities. Again, it all has to play out. It's not a guarantee. We're not suggesting we can read the future and that it's all going to be perfect and positive. But at the same time, from what we can see from Canadians, they are still hoping to see that that's the case.
Yeah. And I mean, I think we don't have to get into it now, but I think for reference, I just finished teaching a course on the business of the World Cup. So I've dove into this in certain ways. A really good reference to have this conversation is to look at the legacies, both extrinsic and intrinsic, that the Vancouver Olympics left in this country and in Vancouver itself. And I think there's some good comparators. It's a good way to have that conversation.
Yeah, totally. And there was just a good question in the chat. And I'll, maybe because we're lingering on it, I'll just address it now rather than at the end. In this research, very much so, we have not prompted them with kind of, here's the balance sheet. And I want to be clear that that's an intentional decision to kind of have a picture of the Canadians' attitudes towards this event. If you just stop them on the street and kind of like, without prompting, there will be the opportunity once the event's said and done and the balance sheet is kind of settled to first understand organically how they feel without us kind of putting it in front of them, and then be a little more pointed in the research to potentially say, did you know this was the final bill? Now, how do you feel, and stuff like that. Because obviously, as we've said, many Canadians are still kind of existing on a, hey, I know it's coming and I'm excited to watch level. And then the number who might be a little more in depth on how much it's costing and what the latest budget info was, maybe a much smaller group. So I wanted to address that and make it clear that we're asking Canadians about their sentiment at this point. It's kind of as they are, undisturbed with a news article that we've prompted them with, which naturally may solicit more, divisive opinions. I did want to talk about ticket prices quickly. Wave one of this research was before we even knew what matches we were getting, and then kind of the matches came out and the ticket prices came out. We want to absolutely confirm something that I'll just call it out on the right half of the slide. 89%, so everyone in research almost said that the tickets were higher than they expected. And keep in mind, like, that's a pretty strong finding, considering I think we hadn't asked before, but I think the average Canadian would probably have already assumed that the ticket prices were going to be very high. It's extremely high, even in the two markets that are potentially able to attend. So 97% of those surveyed in Vancouver said they were higher than they expected. Obviously, on the left, sorry, before I get into perceptions of the prices, about 1 in 4 Canadians took a gander to see what, tell us that they checked out the prices or at least read something about them to gauge whether they might go. I'd like to meet the 1% who did in our survey say that they were lower than they expected. And I hope they have a great fun time at the event, but there they are. So, we can confirm that maybe some of the downward trending results we saw wave over wave came as price got introduced. For me as a researcher, I'll be honest, even if we're working outside sponsorship or sports and entertainment, the second you introduce price, unless it's ludicrously low, it's always going to soften, anticipation, right? If we say, how excited are you about this new automobile or this new product, you'll always see a drop of 10, 20, 30 points once you put a price on it. But I think there was sticker shock everywhere at these prices, and it is very real. It's very clear in research, as much as I said on some earlier slides, that you typically don't get much more than 60% or 70% agreement, even for something that's commonly agreed upon. We do here have 90% saying, that those are a lot. We still see some people say, yes, I'm willing to pay it. But at the same time, we know most Canadians, probably won't be in these buildings. They'll be maybe at fan festivals or maybe other places like that where they can engage. Cheri, what have you felt and heard? I kind of live in the industry where, candidly, lots of people get to go to events because of who they know and they sponsor. And I'm not saying you don't, but to some extent, I'm wondering with students and, people who aren't necessarily often kind of comp tickets or in the circle of industry. What do they tell you about their excitement?
Are you getting comp tickets for that?
No,
Is that what you're telling me, Adam? Because I want to become closer friends with you then.
You did a webinar, so if I had some, you'd have them. But I don't.
Yes, I'm sure that was in my rider.
You get what I mean? Like, what is I'm trying to think back to myself as like a graduate student, and
right. I mean, I think there's a couple of other really interesting things. One being, I think even Canada Soccer had some confusion, right? Because FIFA changed some rules once they released the initial domain of what the tickets were. So marketplace confusion. So I think that's part of it. And then the resale ticket issue. I know this is the students have been talking about on campus in terms of that they've changed the resale market. And so maybe will it look different in Ontario versus other markets for these tickets? So I think those are interesting things just to bring up.
I think so too. And this is, that the news for those who aren't super local is just basically Ontario, which is only one of 2 host cities, has instituted a cap where you can't resell tickets for more than what you paid for them. And obviously there's a massive conversation from Taylor Swift to Jays to even a concert on a Tuesday night. Sometimes you pull up and see people doubling, tripling the ticket of prices of tickets. What it's in the short term looking like, at least from my eyes, looking at Raptors playoff tickets here in the city of Toronto, is it's completely shut down the inventory, right? Because now there's just no incentive to put that inventory out there.
No.
And there's kind of been, I don't know, it seems mostly young people at the office, younger than I am. They've kind of clued into the game that if you want to go to a live event, you just wait till the last minute to buy a ticket. because eventually there'll be something available. And, if there's a crunch on inventory, because it's now people are going, well, there's no point in selling these if I don't make more money. I'm just going to go or give them away or sell them for face value to somebody I know. Maybe that'll change. But it's very interesting times when we have ticket prices happening at the exact same time. Ontario has capped resale prices and done it in a very forceful way. It's not just kind of an asterisk, like you cannot do it on Ticketmaster. It won't let you move the slider.
Even a bit of the free market. So it's interesting for sure.
Exactly. So one of the things we'll dive into in the research that's in field right now is asking Canadians about these fan festivals. I think, you've got qualitative pictures from my friend in Victoria. Simon, thank you for taking some pictures for me. That looked like a very vibrant, happy event. That wasn't even the World Cup. That was a friendly, kind of a trial event. So, that's one data point. We'll have to see. And, there was a question from Neil in the chat about like what KPI, and of course, depending on your objectives, whether you're in business or legacy, you'd pick something different. For me, as interested in fan engagement, I'm keenly interested in the health and the attendance of those events in the community that get people who can't afford, private tickets or tickets to the event. Will they be excited? Will they leave their house, even potentially pay to go to one of these events and these concerts, et cetera? You know what I'm saying? So I think for me, the health of those, whether it's just like attendance or how they went for the city, will be a very key thing, because they're one of the ways that hosting, aside from the building itself and the affluent people who are lucky enough to get tickets, or the fans who got lucky in the lotto, we know that's going to happen, and we know people are going to watch at home, and we know, just like every World Cup, people are probably going to gather in bars and watch. But Toronto and Vancouver hosting, the one thing that kind of is said to be different is now you have the rights to really host these big parties that engage everybody and have a place for everybody to cheer and celebrate. The health, visitation, attendance, fullness of those events will be a real key indicator, at least for me, sitting, caring about kind of what Canadians feel about things. I don't know. It's tough, Cheri. It's like a lob of a hot potato to say, like, what is the one KPI, from a legacy perspective, and you don't have to necessarily be boxed into one number, but if you imagine a year from now, we're looking at some report, where's your eye standing as you flip through some kind of legacy recap to see one number that you kind of shout about if it comes true?
From the economic impact perspective?
Yeah. Any numbers that might come out of FIFA? I was kind of asking, like, aside from dollars.
It's interesting, and I know maybe you can address Simon's question too, and I'll just comment on that. But it is interesting, and over the last 6 months, right? Originally, the numbers were about 380-75 in the cost of Toronto, and 2-3 times that in Vancouver. And Simon's right; it's going to be over $1 billion.
Keeps going.
They're arguing that's it's very similar to the economic impact that we're going to see in the. So, I mean, I like to look at these also critically. I think it will be interesting. The legacy piece is going to be interesting, in whatever economic impact moves. I think both cities will behave a little differently, and so it'll be interesting. Maybe even with the pulse, we can break that down. There's some things I think that are interesting. So I think the story will be written in that way, but it's obviously costing much more than was expected in the city of Toronto and in Vancouver. Did you want to add? Yeah. That question? Sorry.
I lingered. Yeah. So, like, key takeaways from us, like, at least from this research field, what could we take away? Strip out some of the commentary, just like, what does the data say so far? Knowing that we have 2 more waves yet to go, and you will share those as they go. I have to say it, sentiment still remains largely positive as of February. There's some signs of softening, but largely the scales are still tipped to excited this is happening, know what's coming, gonna engage with it. That being said, as much as there was massive sticker shock, like, it only takes one person with the money to start filling up those seats, right? It only takes 1 out of 100 willing to pay to go. So chances are that's still going to be healthy. And the rest will find other ways to engage, even if they've been shut out of the ticket game. I think the one thing we'd flag from having tracked pro sports teams, Olympics, all sorts of stuff, Vancouver 2010, part of the reason Vancouver 2010 lives so strong in our collective memory and was, I think, largely deemed a massive success. There's can be lots of discussion about that, but we're a long way from it now. Is it ended with the golden goal, and it ended with actual on pitch or on ice performance that kind of helped soften those rough spots. And I think we'll call out, 7 in 10 Canadians are cheering for Canada, and how they do on the pitch will play a role in how people perceive the legacy and their sentiment towards this event. Even if I get it, it has nothing to do with it, right? Whether Alfonso scores
in Vancouver,
sorry, go ahead.
The viewing, no, I would argue too, that Sidney Crosby goal was part of it, but the viewership numbers, what was it? 95% of Canadian households, it's a winter sport, consumed part of the game. So yeah, there's some really interesting dynamics. And as I said, I really like to compare Vancouver, because I think it also grew the industry, Vancouver, and which is a whole other topic for another time. So
totally. I totally agree.
Interesting.
Okay, sorry, and you're right. I got into it, and we want to make sure we leave a little time. I tried to get the Q&A during, so we don't have too many.
No, you're good.
We have one more check-in. Canadians are telling us as I speak, not online. They're taking a poll about this with the same numbers. We'll be releasing high-level results in the next couple weeks. If you registered for this, you'll get an email about it, or you can point somebody at the download that was shared in the chat to make sure. I want to throw to Cheri. Can you talk a bit about what's happening during and the partnership, of which this is just one small part?
Sure. So super fortunate to work with IMI and sponsor Pulse. Most of you don't know probably who I am or why I'm here, but my full-time gig is a professor at Toronto Metropolitan University in Toronto. But I run a Future of Sport Lab, which is a sport tech incubator, really grounded around sport innovation. But we will be announcing in more detail a legacy project that we will be doing in partnership with a couple levels of government. And that will include a sport business tech summit right before World Cup kicks off in Toronto. And really capitalizing on the conversations related to what's the state of the industry and what are some opportunities for growth. And so that is part of it. This is also part of the work that we're doing too. So I appreciate the time, Adam, to weigh in on that.
Awesome. Looking forward to it. If you're registered here, there's a way to get a hold of us. Like if we need to connect you to the right people, you're interested in that event, let us know and we can make sure you find that. I know many might be like, okay, I've had enough. You gave me what I needed. I got the info, but I will try to hang and just address a couple questions. And if anybody, including you, Cheri, I know it's getting late, need to drop, you're welcome to. So I'll just call out a couple questions that did come in before that I'm going to try to answer. How are the games in Canada being impacted by the politics in the US? Candidly, from the data we're seeing and continue to see about Canadians, pride and tensions and things like that, I don't want to position some things that are happening in the US in a positive light, but I just say the main impact, I suspect, is going to be that Canadians are more likely to get rah, rah, rah and cheer for Canada to play very well. We've seen that in Four Nations. We've seen that at the Olympics, that what is going on is a resurgence of, Maple Leaf flag waving. And, yes, every day there's something new. And so I don't want to suggest that that's a firm position, but I think the main impact is going to be a lot of excitement for the men's national team. We had a question about how do everybody in this ecosystem, rights holders, properties, kind of plan for the effect after the tournament. And I don't mean to answer that great question with somebody in the chat, but Mac Tershon, sorry if I said your name wrong, actually gave us a nice stat in this chat, which is at the time they were working for Ontario Basketball and they saw doubling of youth enrollment after the Raptors championship. So I could have pulled out some dusty stat from my own work, but I'm just going to say expect a doubling. I'm kidding. But you get what I'm saying is, one of the things we've said is get ready. If you're in soccer post this event, get ready to be on the ground and have kids excited about the sport like never before. I do believe that'll be the case. If there's one audience that isn't particularly discerning about budgets, it's going to be young people, 13, 10-year-olds, etc. They're going to just be super excited that this is happening at a time they can watch and that maybe they get to go to a party to watch it. So I think that the youth impact won't be as nearly complicated. And I think I got through all of them. If I didn't, I'll try to catch up with you. You can always reach out to Sponsor Pulse and we'll direct traffic. And if I missed your question, I'm sorry, we got too excited. Thank you for the engagement. Thank you, Cheri. I know you're traveling.
Of course, it's fine.
It's super fun to do this with you. I hope it was fun for you too. And we'll cut it off there, but please reach out if you have any further questions or want to continue the conversation.
Thanks. Happy weekend.
Happy weekend, everybody.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.